Okay, everybody, welcome back to our second class on Capuchin Franciscan history. We already saw how Matteo de Bascio, who was a young 25-year-old friar from the marches of Ancona, who went to his provincial and wanted to live the radical Franciscan life. Now his provincial kind of, put up with him and his hungerings, and then he eventually went with the assistance of Catherine of Cibo, the Duchess of Camerino, to the Holy Father and got permission to live the life of St. Francis radically, to live the rule with great fidelity, much in the line of the early Franciscans. And then we saw how he got permission from the Holy Father to wear the traditional habit with the long pointed hood going down to the cord. Secondly, he got permission to live the rule with fidelity without mitigations. And third, he had the permission to go about preaching. But then he also had a fourth condition. That fourth condition was that he was to present himself to the Minister General once a year at the the provincial minister once a year at the provincial chapter. And we saw how Matteo, because he was afraid, didn't do that. And a result of that, Giovanni da Fano, had him put in prison because he was a fugitive from obedience. And then we read that great letter by the Duchess of Camerino, Catherine of Cibo, the niece of the Pope, basically telling, Giovanni da Fano, you better release him right away or else. And we saw how Giovanni da Fano was more than willing to release Matteo de Bascio from prison. Now, it's important to note that Matteo only had permission for himself. He didn't have permission to receive novices. He didn't have permission to start a reform. He didn't have permission to live with other brothers. He had permission for himself to wear the long pointed hood, to go about preaching, and to live the rule radically. Okay? That's important because what happens is Matteo really doesn't have the permission to bring others in. So when others want to come in, they have to do that legwork and not him. He really wasn't looking to start a whole reform movement. Matteo just wanted to be faithful himself and live the life himself. Now, along his preaching tour, he went to the town of Metallica, not the old 80s band. he went to the town of Metallica, and there in the town of Metallica, he ran into Fra Francesco of Cartocetto. So Fra Francesco was this old friar who for years had been given permission to live the rule radically in a hermitage. And he lived there with a third order Franciscan, Fra Pacifico. And the two of them were living there and praying the divine office, living in radical poverty, living the rule that St. Francis had written without mitigation. But Fra Francesco was truly longing for the days of the reform of the entire order. And so it was promised to him by God that he would live to see the reform of the order. And so the night before Matteo had actually arrived at that little hermitage friary, Fra Francesco had a dream. And in the dream, he saw a young friar coming to him dressed in the traditional Franciscan habit. So Fra Pacifico met up with Fra Matteo, brought Fra Matteo to see Fra Francesco. Fra Francesco saw Matteo, they sat down, they talked, and Matteo told the whole story of his encountering with the leper that was actually Christ and his desire to live the rule and then getting permission from the Pope. And Fra Francesco was so excited that he told Fra Pacifico to make him a habit similar to that of Fra Matteo. So Fra Pacifico went to work sewing and sewed the hood onto his tunic, and then he clothed old Fra Francesco in the habit, and then Fra Francesco folded his hands and died. And he went on to his eternal reward. He lived to see the beginning of the reform just as he was promised by the Lord. It does call to mind the prophet Simeon, who was told by the Lord that he wouldn't see death until he saw the Messiah. And so Fra Francesco de Cartocetto, he doesn't see death until he sees the beginning of the reform of the order. A glorious day for him that he shut his eyes on the reform of the order and opened his eyes on the face of Christ Jesus himself. Okay? So in the meantime, while Fra Matteo is meeting up with Fra Francesco, Matteo de Bascio lit this match, right? Lit the match, all of a sudden a fire breaks out. And part of that fire were two particular friars who are fires who would light up the world, would be Ludivico and Raffaele Fossombrone. They were blood brothers. Ludivico was a priest and Raffaele was a lay brother. And so the news of what Matteo de Bascio kind of reached them. And they were like, yes, we want this too. We want to live the radical rule like Matteo de Bascio has permission to do. And so they're from the same province as Matteo. And so they possibly knew him already. And so they go to John of Fano and they ask permission to retire to a primitive friary, a hermitage friary, live the rule radically, and to live with others who also want to live the rule radically. And Giovanni da Fano, who was hungry for reform, said no. Why he said no, we don't know. Perhaps he had other things in mind for the two of them to do. I don't know, but he said no. But that was not going to stop the incredible bulldozer that Ludivico Fossombrone was. And so Ludovico Fossombrone, his brother, basically went out to go live the life. And they went to the jurisdiction of the conventuals, to the general there named Cingoli, and they asked him permission, the town of Cingoli, he asked them permission to join the conventuals so that the conventuals would give them the permission to live the rule radically, to live according to the rule as St. Francis had written it. And so, but they really didn't let him. And so, because Giovanni da Fano, he appealed to the Minister General of the Order and the Pope, and received from the Pope a papal bull, or papal brief, on March 18, 1526, declaring the Fossombrone brothers apostates because they had absconded from underneath obedience without the permission of the provincial, trying to transfer to the conventuals. And so Giovanni da Fano had permission to imprison these two by the Minister General and by the Pope because they were running outside of obedience. So Giovanni da Fano went in pursuit of these two boys and found where they fled. And he courted them. He had, Giovanni da Fano had a bunch of friars with him. And they courted Ludovico and Fossombrone in a farmhouse. And they're about to go in and capture them. But Ludovico, being the bit of a shyster that he was, he lit candles up all over the house. And then he and his brother were making all these shadow images and making the friars outside think that they had all these men in there who were going to go out there and beat up the friars. So Giovanni da Fano and the other friars got afraid and they took off and they left. And Ludivico and Raffaele's little scheme worked. It's kind of funny. I knew a friar who's kind of a little bit of a renegade himself, and he lives at that old farmhouse. I don't know if he's still there, but he was living there. He said it was very musty. Anyway, it's a cute little story of how they had this little roost to get away from John of Fano so they wouldn't go into prison, right? So the Saturday before Palm Sunday, the Fossombrone brothers presented themselves before the Camaldolese hermits in Maseccio. Now, there was a reform already in progress for the Camaldolese hermits, and that reform was being run by Blessed Paul of Giustiniani. And so now there is a Blessed Paul brought around the reform of the Camaldolese hermits, so there was kind of a split in the Camaldolese hermits. Okay, here in the United States, we have one Camaldolese hermitage out in California, Big Sur, the non-reformed. And then in Bloomington, Ohio, we have the reformed, or the Camaldolese of Monte Corona, as they're called. And so Ludovico and Raffaele Fossombrone sought out the Camaldolese hermits, particularly to Blessed Paul of Giustiniani, for that assistance to protect them, but to protect their reform movement. And they were brought in and given protection. And this formed a real good friendship between the Camaldolese and the Capuchins. There's a lot of similarities between the Capuchins and the Camaldolese. The praying of the 7 hours of the divine office, the wearing of the beard, the long pointed hood, the praying the office recto tono. The only difference is the Capuchins had the active apostolate, where the Camaldolese live in hermitages, pray the office together, and go back to their hermitage. They don't have any active apostolate. But there's a great relationship that developed between these two communities that was really beautiful. There are some who say that the Capuchins got the long pointed hood from the Camaldolese, but that really doesn't make sense because Matteo de Bascio had already put on the long pointed hood before the Fossombrone brothers went and hid with the Camaldolese hermits. And it's quite possible that St. Francis got the idea of the long pointed hood from the Camaldolese. It's also possible that St. Francis began to chant the office recto tono, not the Gregorian chant, just the straight chant, like, "Oh God, come to my assistance. Oh Lord, make haste to help me." Got that simple, plain chant from the Camaldolese, because the Camaldolese hermitage is not far from Laverna. So it's quite possible that St. Francis stopped in there, and that's where he learned that recto tono chant. But who knows? That's just speculation because there's nothing in history books about that. But I don't believe that we got the long pointed hood from the Camaldolese because Matteo de Bascia was already wearing the long pointed hood. Perhaps it encouraged them, but it certainly was not from the Camaldolese themselves. So the observant at this point, Giovanni da Fano, was sick of these two boys, the Fossombroni brothers, Ludivico, Raffaele, and so they told the Camaldolese to keep them, and the Camaldolese were going to accept them as part of the community, but then Giovanni da Fano a few days later changed his mind and wanted the guys back, and so the Camaldolese hermits dressed them up as Camaldolese and snuck them out of their hermitages and sent them off into to get away from Giovanni da Fano, and later on they kind of came back around. These two, after they escaped, they came back. And they asked to be accepted by the Camaldolese. So Ludovico and Raphael Fossombroni were actually asking to become Camaldolese hermits, but they were refused. The Camaldolese said, "No, you have a different charism. We're not going to accept you, and you have a different charism." So Ludovico and Raphael Fossombroni began to seek out Matteo de Bascia. They went looking for him, and so Matteo informed Ludovico that he had to go to Rome to obtain permission for himself because Matteo had no authority to accept anyone. Matteo just had his permission for himself. He didn't have permission for anybody else. And so he said, if you want to become part of the life, you're going to have to go get your own permission to do this. And so, because Matteo had no permission to receive people, right? So Catherine of Cibo, the Duchess of Camerino, promised Ludovico her assistance. And so Ludovico's ideas were a bit different from Matteo's. He wanted permission not just for himself and for his brother Raffaele. He wanted permission to receive others. He really wanted to start a reform movement. Remember, Matteo, he wasn't looking really to start a reform. But Ludovico Fossombroni and Raffaele Fossombroni were. And so Ludovico received from the Grand Penitentiary a permission for Ludovico, Matteo, and Raffaele to live in a hermitage friary according to the rule of 1223. Now remember, hermitage friary is not simply a friary where they hide away and they do no apostolate. A hermitage friary would be a friary about a mile or so out of town, out of the city, small enough to hold about 12 guys, where they would observe the common life of meals together, prayers together, recreation together, may go out and do some apostolate, but then return home. And so the hermitage friary referred to the smaller hermitages. So they received that permission to live in that smaller hermitage. So, according to the brief that they received, they first had to ask permission of the provincial, and if he refused, then they can use the brief. They were also given the permission to live under the Bishop of Camerino, the town of Camerino, which is where the first friary will be established, in the town of Camerino. They were given permission to beg and to all other privileges of the friars. They must retain the habit of the observance. That was a bit different, huh? And they had no permission to receive others. So the Pope didn't write this brief. The penitentiary did. And the penitentiary was known for selling briefs, so they kind of wrote this brief out. They gave it to him. I don't know if Catherine paid for it or not to get it written, but it wasn't what Raffaele and Ludovico Fossombroni were looking for. In the meantime, the minister provincial, Giovanni da Fano, and the minister general, Quinones, objected to the Pope's brief. And so Pope Clement VII, he disapproved of the brief. And so that caused a little bit of a tension there. So the penitentiary wrote the brief. The minister general, the minister general and the provincial objected, and then the Holy Father sided with the minister general and the provincial. Now, Paolo de Chioggia joined the three. Paolo. So we have Matteo, Raffaele Fossombroni, Ludovico Fossombroni, and now we have Paolo. And don't forget we had Fra Francesco, who already died, right? So now we have the four of them. So he was an observant priest, Paolo de Chioggia, who had taken a leave in order to care for his mother. He desired to live the rule. He went to Rome and received permission to wear the original habit and live the rule strictly. And afterward, he went to Fabriano and met up with Matteo de Bascia. Paolo may have been living in Venice with Fra Angelico, a dissident who, without permission, was inspired by Matteo, another one inspired by Matteo, to wear the traditional habit and live the radical rule. So Paolo may have been living in a hermitage already, receiving men, but he went to Rome in order to receive the permission that Angelico never did. And so, Paolo wanted to do things by the book. So you have the four of them now. Now, the minister provincial, Giovanni da Fano, was armed with a papal brief in a pursuit of these four now fugitives. The Duke of Urbino refused to take action. He had an eye to marrying Catherine of Cibo's daughter, and so he wasn't going to do anything about it. And the Duke and Duchess of Camerino took the four into their care and protection, so there was no way that Giovanni da Fano, was going to get a hold of these four, being protected by both the Duke and the Duchess of Camerino. So a meeting was arranged for the Duke, the Duchess, the provincial, Giovanni da Fano, and the four friars to meet together to discuss this issue. So Catherine was a reasonable woman. Don't get her angry, but she was a reasonable woman, so she called them together to have a little discussion about what was taking place. And so the minister provincial, Giovanni da Fano, upbraided the four of them and pleaded for their return. But Matteo, he pulled out from his sleeve the rule and protested, "This is the cause why we have left the community, to observe this rule. We left the community where we could not observe it." So that was Matteo's response to all that Giovanni da Fano was throwing at him. Let me repeat that again. He pulled out the rule from his sleeve, like he kept it in his sleeve, and he pulls the rule out from his sleeve, and he holds up, "This is the cause why we have left the community, to observe this rule. We left the community where we could not observe it." So again, this harkens back to the permission that Francis gave that those who can't observe the rules spiritually shall have recourse to their provincial. And here he is claiming the right to live that rule as he had vowed, right? So Ludivico Fossombrani responded by speaking of all the relaxations and continued with, "Things being as they are in the community, can the minister accuse us of desertion and apostasy, seeing that St. Francis and the apostolic life have freed us from apostasy?" In other words, he's saying, you're going to accuse me of apostasy because I don't have the obedience to be living the rule that I vowed? You can't do that unless you're going to accuse St. Francis and the early followers of apostasy. You can't accuse me of it because they lived it. I'm living it. That's the charism, and I'm embracing it. So the meeting ended with the Duke and Duchess defending the four friars and asking the minister provincial, Giovanni da Fano, to leave. And so she was kind about it. And so he left. So a year later, 1527, a great plague struck Camerino. Again, remember we saw that earlier in the life of Matteo de Bascio. He went to Camerino during the plague and he served the plague victims. Well, in 1527, another plague hit Camerino. And the friars went to work caring for the sick there. There was four of them. And by their care of the stricken, the four won the esteem of all. May of that same year, Rome was attacked by the emperor's troops, and the pope was held prisoner, and all the priests and religious were treated badly in Rome. The Duke of Camerino died of the plague, leaving the city unsafe of Camerino. So just a little thing there about some of the struggles going on, but the friars in Camerino really did a lot to solidify their life by their service to the poor during the time of the plague. Now, during the Observant General Chapter, they vowed to renew their efforts in ending the reform. This reform was going to end, period, end of story. Why they were so worried about these four guys, I don't know, but they were. So Catherine of Cibo and the Bishop of Camerino requested the Conventual General to take the four under his protection. Remember, we saw how Ludivico Fossombrani and Raffaele Fossombrani want to go underneath the conventuals for protection. And now we have the Catherine of Cibo, Duchess of Camerino, with the Bishop of Camerino asking the conventuals to take them under their protection. And the Minister General agreed under the condition that for dependents, they would have to appear at the provincial chapters, to which they agreed to. They thought that was reasonable. So Catherine understood the dangerous position of the reform, and so she petitioned her uncle, the Pope, to intervene. And so the Pope, having had fled Rome, happened to be in Viterbo, which is not far from Camerino. And so Catherine brought her petition to her uncle, the Pope. the Pope Clement VII. And he decided to wait till he could take counsel. So in July 3rd, 1528, he issued the Papal Bull Religionis Zelus. And this basically becomes the flag document, or I should say the Declaration of Independence for the Capuchins. This is the document that actually allows them the freedom to live the rule radically. It's the kind of the document that establishes them as a distinct and separate reform movement. So they were given San Cristoforo, a church of Presbytery, in Camerino as the first friary. So the use of the small unused Benedictine priory was given to the friars by the Bishop of Camerino, and it was approximately 1 mile from the city. They recently restored it to its original luster just a short time ago. Somewhere on my bookshelf here, I have pictures of Camerino. I think these are books here. Some of this one here has Convento dei Capuchin di Camerino. It's about the restoration, and so it's got some nice pictures of the original building, the prints of the original building, and so if you want to take a look at it, I'll have it here on the bookshelf so you can take a peek. I'll just lay it on the bookshelf. But it shows the troccatas that are in there, and so maybe you can see the picture. Hold up, that's kind of the entrance there to Camerino, the beautiful first friary, right? A great place. I've stayed there a number of times. They've added on to it, and it's a great, beautiful place. And this is the La Terracotta dei Cappuccini Camerino, so the terracottas in the friary there, which beautiful little stories about them and stuff. And there's actually a nice Capuchin museum there, where you get a good look at the Capuchin tabernacles. So I'll leave these right here if anyone wants to take a look at those. Okay? So but that was the original friary. So when 5 more observant friars came to join, they opened a house in Colmenzone. When another 6 from the observant friars had come to them, they opened another house in Montemelone, where Ludivico was chosen guardian of the house. So by the early part of 1528, 2 more friaries were opened. Albacina in the diocese of Montefelbrone. Okay, it was one of them. Albacina becomes a very important spot. It's merely a small chapel with barely any space around it. But it becomes important because that's where they wrote their first set of constitutions, the constitutions of Albacino, the statutes of Albacina. So it does become an important place. So that's when they opened it up, as in the early part of 1528. A rich secular by the name of Girolamo della Scoriolo joined the friars and took the name Bernardo after Bernardo de Quintavalle. And like Bernardo de Quintavalle, remember the first one who joined St. Francis, who gave everything away to the poor, this Bernardo distributed his goods to the poor in the public square, much in the manner of the great Bernardo Quintavalle, who Francis would call his firstborn son. Okay? I'm going to end this chapter here because I think so. Let me see here. Actually, no, we can do it just a little bit more. I want to look at the Bull Religionis Zelus because in the next class, we'll look at the constitutions of Albacina and how they came to be written. And then that's going to be rather involved. So what we'll do is we'll go over the Bull Religionis Zelus by Pope Clement VII and take it from there, okay? So the Papal Bull Religionis Zelus was written by Pope Clement VII on July 3rd, 1528. And so how the bull was obtained, as I mentioned, the niece of the Pope, Catherine of Cibo, obtained the bull for the friars while the Pope was in Viterbo fleeing Rome. And it legalized the new congregation. The Duchess of Camerino made it known in all the public squares, Religionis Zelus. She made sure that everybody in her duchy knew who exactly these friars were. So the papal bull addressed Ludivico and Raffaele Fossombrone, not Matteo. It addressed Ludivico and Raffaele Fossombrone, not Matteo. So it's written to them. And in it, they're given the freedom to live the eremitical life. Now, in this part of the 16th century, when they speak about the eremitical life, they're not speaking about going and becoming hermits. They're speaking about living in those hermitage-style friaries as opposed to living in the large, conventual monastery-type friaries. It's very important. Many people very much misunderstand Religionis Zelus, and they think that somehow the friars were looking to be hermits without an apostolate. That was not the case. They were seeking to live like the early Franciscans, like St. Francis. So if you go to the Portiuncula and see how it was originally made and originally built, it was a very simple, poor friary, a hermitage friary. You go to Fonte Colombo, or you go to Greccio, or you go to Cortona, you see the early friaries, or even Gubbio. They were small friaries built outside the cities, and they were called hermitages, even though the brothers had an active apostolate. Very important, because too many people who will claim that the friars were just seeking to be hermits. Okay? So, they were given the permission to observe the rule of 1223. Okay? To wear the beard, to wear the pointed hoods, permission to preach, remain under the conventual authority. So they were taken out from the authority of the observance and put under the authority of the conventuals. Now, maybe it was because it's only a few years after 1517, with the decree of Ite Vos, that the conventuals were more than happy to take the reformers of the reform under their wings and kind of like snub their noses at the observance. You left us for reform, huh? How does it feel, right? So maybe that's why the conventuals were more than happy to take them in. So they were authorized to receive priests, lay brothers, and other religious and lay people. They were able to receive priests, lay people, and other religious into the community. And they had the permission to be anywhere. They didn't have to ask anybody's permission where they were going to set up their friaries. They were granted the full and complete permission and faculties to enjoy each and every privilege granted to the observant friars and to the camaldolese. Is that interesting? That the document particularly mentions the observant friars and the camaldolese, that the Capuchins had the same permissions that were given to them. They were given the protection under the Bishop of Camerino, and so it really put them in a spot where they had the permission from the Holy Father, the protection of the conventuals, and the protection of the Bishop of Camerino. And they were given everything they wanted, everything they needed in order to observe the life as they vowed God to do. So the immediate results of the bull. So they get this bull, Ludivico and Raffaele for Sombrone. They got Matteo, they got Paolo, they got all these other guys we were talking about. And a large number of observant professed and novices joined their reform. They were flooded with observant friars who really wanted to live the life but couldn't live it in the observance, who left and joined the friars. And so they needed to found more friaries. There was a great need for more organization because they had now all these guys, went from just being a handful, like all these guys. So Matteo was considered to be the father of the reform, but it was clear that Ludivico was really the one in control, and the bull addressed Ludivico. Ludivico and Raffaele kind of looked to Matteo, but Matteo was like, yeah, I'm not a leader. You guys got to handle it, And so they did. For sure they did. Ludivico, for sure he did. Okay. So in April of 1529, the Capuchins had their first general chapter. And they held their first general chapter in Albacina, the town of Albacina, small little friary in the top of the hill in Albacina. And it consisted of 12 friars, just 12 of them, the chapter. And the purpose was to elect ministers, draw up constitutions, which would only be a guide used for the rule. We were very clear in the beginning. The constitutions were going to be a guide to live the rule, not mitigate the rule. Very important. As I mentioned in the beginning of last class, you can write a set of constitutions that mitigate the rule, or you can write a set of constitutions that lead to living the rule, that protect the rule. And that was their intent. Okay? And their only guide to writing it was prayer and the rule itself. Now, the 1529 was their first constitutions and most of the work of Ludivico. And it pretty much follows the constitutions of the observance, except where the observant constitutions have mitigations. They just kind of cut out the mitigations. So really the constitutions was somewhat of an edit of the observant constitutions, which were building on the constitutions of Narbonne back to the time of Bonaventure. The title of the constitutions were the Costituzione dei Frati Trattati della Vita Eremitica, the constitutions of the friars of the eremitical life. So they're probably bouncing off of the Bull Religionis Zelus, where it spoke about them as the friars of the eremitical life. And so they kind of grabbed that name. That name didn't stay with them too long, as we'll see. They adopted a little nickname along the way. Okay? So most of the constitutions are a response and reaction to the existing abuses in the observance. Now, with regards to the elections, Matteo was elected the Vicar General, because the Minister General of the Conventuals was the Minister General, and Matteo was the Vicar General. So he was in charge of the reform. He didn't want to, but the 12 friars of the chapter compelled him to accept it. But 10 days later, he surrendered the seals of the order because he simply wanted to be an itinerant preacher. He resigned in a matter of 10 days. And so after those 10 days, Ludivico Fossombroni was elected first definitor, became the Vicar General when Matteo resigned. Now, the name. Friars of the eremitical life never took. People in the streets, especially the children, would see their long, big hoods of the friars and yell out, "It's Capuchin," or simply nicknamed Capuccini, the hoods. And so since 1534, a few years after the writing of this, so 5 years after the writing of the constitutions, within 5 years, they get known as the Cappuccini. At 1534, even papal documents called them the Cappuccini, the Capuchins. And so it's rather a fun thing that their name, which has stuck with them for the past 500 years, came as a nickname from children, calling them the hoods, So I like to jokingly say that we're the first boys in the hood. Okay, next time I'll start with a little snippet, a little fun thing about the name from the Chronicles, where the chronicler basically reflects upon the persecutions they started going through and how the name Capuchin fit them well. Okay, so we'll catch up next time on that. May Almighty God bless you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.